The night had not yet loosened its grip on the land when the crying began. It was not loud at first, barely more than a thin, broken sound drifting through the fog that clung to the Alabama fields like damp cloth. Most slept through it. Those who didn't would later swear they thought they were dreaming, that the sound slipped too strangely into the darkness to be real. In a place where suffering was constant but orderly, where pain followed rules and hierarchies, there were some noises the mind refused to fully accept. The woman who heard it clearly was already awake. Sleep rarely came easily to her anymore. The air inside the slave quarters was thick and unmoving, heavy with the smell of bodies, old wood, and the faint sweetness of rotting crops outside. She lay still at first, listening, hoping the sound would fade or prove itself to be nothing more than a restless night bird. But it came again, sharper this time, unmistakably human, unmistakably new. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb the others. Outside, the ground was cool beneath her bare feet, damp with dew. The sky was still black, but the darkness had begun to thin at the edges, as though dawn were pressing against it from the other side. The crying led her toward the far edge of the quarters, where the land dipped slightly and the trees grew closer together. Each step felt wrong, as if she were moving toward something she was not meant to see. The child lay wrapped in a scrap of cloth near the base of an old fence post. There was no one else in sight. No mother collapsed nearby, no footprints in the soft soil that made sense. Just the baby, squirming weakly, face red with effort as it cried. She knelt slowly, breath caught in her chest, and reached out with hands that trembled despite years of hard labor and harder losses. When she pulled the cloth back, the world tilted. The baby's skin was pale. Not light brown, not the soft variation of tone that existed among the enslaved children she had known all her life, but pale in a way that seemed almost unreal in the dim morning light. Even before the sun rose enough to clarify it, she could see it clearly, as if the child were catching and reflecting what little light existed. Wisps of hair clung to its head, fine, light, almost the color of dry straw. For a moment, she could not move. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them landing, none of them safe. She had lived long enough to understand the rules of this world, rules enforced with whips and prayers alike. She understood what skin meant here. What blood meant. What could not be questioned without consequence. The baby cried again, louder now, and instinct finally overpowered fear. She gathered the child into her arms, holding it close, feeling the small, frantic heartbeat against her own. It felt warm, alive, fragile. Real. Whatever else it was not a dream. By the time others began to stir, word had already started to spread. Whispers moved faster than daylight in places like this. People emerged cautiously from the quarters, drawn by the tension in the air rather than any single voice calling out. When they saw the child, the whispers stopped altogether. Silence fell heavy and sudden, the kind of silence that carries more terror than noise ever could. No one wanted to be the first to speak. The plantation had rules for everything, work, punishment, prayer, but there were no rules for this. The men exchanged looks, brows furrowed, jaws tight. The women stared too long, then looked away, hands instinctively covering mouths or folding tightly over their chests. Some crossed themselves. Others murmured words passed down through generations, half-remembered prayers and protective phrases carried from across the ocean long ago. Someone finally ran to the big house. When the overseer arrived, the sun was just beginning to break free of the horizon. Its light spilled across the fields, revealing the baby in full clarity. There was no denying it now. No shadow or trick of darkness could explain what everyone was seeing. The overseer stood rigid, his face hardening as he took in the scene. He did not touch the child. He did not need to. Questions were asked sharply, but no answers came. Whose baby was this? Where was the mother? Who had seen anything? Each question fell flat, unanswered, dissolving into the humid air. Fear pressed down on the group from all sides, fear of punishment, fear of accusation, fear of what this meant if it could not be explained. The owner of the plantation arrived next, his nightclothes hastily replaced with a coat thrown on without care. He had not slept well either, though for different reasons. When he saw the child, something flickered across his face before he could stop it. Not shock. Not confusion. Something closer to recognition, quickly buried beneath anger and control. The baby was taken inside. What happened next would never be fully recorded, not honestly, not in ink that could survive time. There were conversations behind closed doors, voices lowered, decisions made with the same cold efficiency used to price crops and bodies alike. By the time the sun stood fully above the fields, the quarters had been ordered back to work. The baby was no longer visible. The morning moved on, as mornings always did. But nothing felt the same. Throughout the day, glances lingered too long. Hands shook when they should not have. Even the overseer seemed distracted, his usual cruelty edged with something uncertain. By evening, the story had already shifted shape. Some said the baby had been sickly, malformed in ways that made its skin deceptive. Others said it was a punishment from God, a test of faith. A few insisted it had never been white at all, that fear had made people see what they expected to see. No version satisfied. That night, sleep came even harder. The image of the child refused to fade, haunting those who had seen it and even those who hadn't. In the darkness, questions crept in where certainty once lived. If this child could exist, what else was possible? What else had been hidden, denied, erased? Days passed, then weeks. The baby was not spoken of openly. Anyone who tried was silenced with sharp looks or quiet warnings. Yet the story persisted, passed carefully from mouth to ear, growing heavier with each telling. Details sharpened rather than blurred. The pale skin. The light hair. The way the owner's face had changed when he saw it. And then, months later, on another plantation miles away, another cry rose before dawn. At first, those who heard of it refused to believe it. Coincidence was easier than implication. But when confirmation came, when trusted voices repeated the same impossible details, something broke loose inside the collective mind of the region. One anomaly could be dismissed. Two suggested a pattern. Patterns demanded explanation, and explanations threatened the foundations of everything they believed. The second child was followed by a third rumor, then a fourth. Some were real. Some were exaggerated. Some may never have existed at all. It hardly mattered. The idea had taken root, and once it did, it could not be controlled. People began to watch more closely. Enslaved women were scrutinized, whispered about, punished preemptively. Night became a time of anxiety rather than rest. Every cry of a newborn carried weight now, every birth shadowed by fear of what might be revealed when the cloth was pulled back. The white infants, as they came to be called in hushed voices, were not just children. They were contradictions made flesh. Living evidence that the boundaries so carefully drawn between bodies and bloodlines were neither natural nor inviolable. They exposed a truth long known but never acknowledged, that the system depended on violence hidden behind certainty, on intimacy forced and then erased. Yet no one said this aloud. Not then. Instead, the land absorbed the tension, the soil holding secrets as it always had. Records were altered or never written. Children vanished into other households, other states, other identities. And the people who had first heard that cry before dawn learned a new kind of silence, one shaped not only by fear of punishment, but by the knowledge that some truths, once seen, could never be unseen. Long after the crying stopped, the echo of it remained, woven into the memory of the place. It lingered in the fields at dawn, in the uneasy stillness before morning work began. A reminder that even in a world built on absolute definitions, reality had a way of breaking through, quietly, relentlessly, one impossible child at a time. The land itself seemed to breathe with stories, some of them whispered, some etched into the soil, and some hidden so deeply that only the keenest eye could detect them. Alabama in the mid-19th century was a place defined by extremes, the lush fertility of the cotton fields contrasting with the brutal rigidity of human hierarchies, the steady rhythm of crops and seasons masking the quiet violence that ensured the system endured. Plantations stretched across the horizon like imposed geometries on a living landscape, with grand white houses standing in stark contrast to the cramped, decaying quarters of the enslaved. Every path, every fence, every tree bore silent witness to generations of suffering and control, a constant reminder that life here was governed by order, and that deviation could not be tolerated. Within this rigidly structured society, the distinction between enslaver and enslaved dictated nearly every aspect of existence. The families who owned the land operated under an unspoken but universally acknowledged principle: hierarchy was divinely sanctioned, absolute, and necessary. Wealth was measured not just in acres or animals but in the number of bodies bound to labor, and the worth of those bodies was determined by skin color, lineage, and obedience. This logic extended into every corner of life, from the simplest chore to the most complex social maneuver, creating an ecosystem in which deviation from expectation was both terrifying and incomprehensible. Enslaved communities lived within the shadows of these systems. Their lives were filled with toil from dawn to dusk, yet within that labor existed pockets of autonomy, small, precarious acts of resistance, coded languages, quiet refusals, and the preservation of traditions passed down through generations. These traditions, often rooted in African heritage, included stories, songs, rituals, and the careful observation of signs and omens. Such practices provided not only comfort but a framework for interpreting a world designed to erase individuality. Here, folklore and spiritual belief were not mere superstition, they were survival tools, interpretive lenses that could give meaning to otherwise senseless suffering. Within the enslaver households, appearances were meticulously maintained. The big house was a theater of propriety and wealth, where manners, dress, and decor reflected status, authority, and control. Every gesture reinforced the hierarchy, every rule served as a reminder of the social order, and every transgression, even the smallest, was corrected with calculated discipline. The plantation owner wielded authority like a sculptor shaping clay, absolute, deliberate, and with no room for error. Yet beneath the surface of this orderly world lurked complexity and contradiction. No amount of planning or control could entirely contain human behavior, human desire, or the unpredictable twists of fate that sometimes, quietly, undermined the system. The land itself participated in this unspoken drama. Rivers cut unpredictable paths through fields, storms arrived without warning, shadows moved across the forest edges, hiding secrets that no plantation plan could anticipate. The fertility of the soil allowed life to flourish in abundance, yet it also bore the memory of death and labor, mixing the scent of growing cotton with the undertone of sweat and fear. The natural world, indifferent to human hierarchies, became a subtle accomplice to the anxieties and whispers that haunted the enslaved and enslavers alike. It was in these spaces, the margins, the edges, the spaces between fields and forests, that the first glimmers of anomaly could take root unnoticed, waiting for someone to see, to question, to fear. The plantation families themselves were often insular, intermarried over generations to preserve land and influence, reinforcing notions of racial purity and social dominance. They prided themselves on lineage, both as a badge of legitimacy and as a means of self-justification for the system they upheld. Education for the children of the household was rigorous but narrowly focused, emphasizing manners, literacy, and the social codes necessary to maintain control over others. Yet, even within these walls, cracks could appear. Secrets, like shadows, gathered in corners where the light of propriety failed to reach. Occasionally, whispers of indiscretion, mismanaged labor, or hidden pregnancies stirred anxiety, but these were typically contained, disciplined, or denied, leaving the outward appearance of perfection intact. For the enslaved, the hierarchy dictated not just physical labor but the rhythm of daily existence. Work began before sunrise and continued until the last light faded, punctuated by strict mealtimes, inspections, and constant oversight. Yet within these constraints, people observed subtle cues, the arrival of visitors, the demeanor of overseers, the whispers between the quarters. Knowledge traveled fast, often faster than news from the outside world. Stories of anomalies, unexpected births, unusual behaviors, or moments of resistance, spread quietly, carried in songs, hushed conversations, or coded gestures. These were stories that had to be measured carefully. Speaking too loudly could invite punishment, but silence carried its own burden, the slow accumulation of fear and unspoken tension. The economy of the region reinforced these social hierarchies, binding the landowners, laborers, and merchants into a network of mutual dependency. Cotton and tobacco were the lifeblood of wealth, yet their production depended on the absolute subjugation of human beings. Markets measured not only the yield of crops but also the control over those who harvested them. Enslaved bodies became capital, and every deviation, every perceived failure, threatened both financial and social stability. Within this context, any anomaly, like a child who did not fit the rigid racial expectations, was not just a personal or moral concern, but a disruption to an entire system that relied on predictability, order, and silence. The geography of Alabama itself shaped perception and movement. Swamps, rivers, and forests created both barriers and hiding places, influencing the ways in which stories traveled and secrets were maintained. Plantation boundaries were carefully monitored, yet the natural world offered blind spots. It was in these spaces that the impossible could appear and disappear, that the rules of the plantation could be bent, ignored, or outright broken without immediate detection. The land was indifferent, yet it held the capacity to magnify human fears, to reflect the anxieties of those who worked it and ruled it alike. Every plantation had its rhythms, its predictable cycles of planting and harvest, its ceremonial moments of inspection, prayer, and punishment. But these rhythms, while comforting in their regularity, were fragile. One unexpected event, a child born outside expectation, a whispered rumor, a disruption of the carefully maintained hierarchy, could ripple outward with disproportionate effect. The system had no built-in mechanism for understanding or integrating anomalies. Instead, it relied on denial, suppression, and the meticulous maintenance of appearances. The land, the labor, the rules, and the social codes all conspired to maintain order, yet beneath this, tension and uncertainty quietly accumulated, waiting for a catalyst. It was into this world, so thoroughly ordered and rigidly enforced, that the first pale child appeared. Its existence challenged not just the expectations of those who lived and worked on the plantations, but the very logic upon which the entire social, economic, and moral structure rested. To acknowledge it fully would be to confront a reality that had been carefully hidden for generations, a truth that many were not prepared to face. And yet, the land, the labor, the communities, and even the silence of the trees seemed to anticipate this disturbance, as though the soil itself remembered the moments when human systems faltered and the unexpected came to light. The people of Alabama moved through their routines with a heightened awareness after that first discovery. The overseer's eyes scanned the quarters more often, the enslaved women watched one another with quiet caution, and the children of the household became objects of even stricter surveillance. Fear, suspicion, and anxiety became woven into daily life, subtle yet persistent, shaping behavior, speech, and thought. Conversations shifted to whispers, glances lingered longer, and the natural rhythms of labor and rest were punctuated by unease. This was a land where silence could carry as much meaning as words, and now the absence of explanation filled the spaces between people with a palpable weight. Even the seasons seemed to respond. Spring's promise of renewal felt hollow, the sun's warmth did not dissipate the tension, and the humidity carried with it a sense of dread rather than comfort. Cotton sprouted, crops grew, but each sprouting stalk was shadowed by the uncertainty now present in every life, every household, every plantation. The land that had once seemed a constant, a dependable partner in the system of labor and control, now mirrored the fragility of the human constructs imposed upon it. The fields, the forests, the rivers, they all held the memory of the first anomaly, the pale child whose existence questioned everything, and they seemed to wait silently for the next rupture, the next impossible occurrence, the next whisper that could shatter certainty once more. The more the people tried to impose order, the more the tension accumulated. Nothing could erase the memory of that first child, and the land itself seemed unwilling to let it be forgotten. Alabama was fertile in both its soil and its secrets, and within that fertility, the boundaries between what was expected and what could not be explained had begun to blur. By the time the sun set each evening, casting long shadows across the plantation, everyone knew, some consciously, some unconsciously, that the world as they understood it had already begun to change, and that nothing about it would ever feel entirely safe or predictable again. The discovery of a second pale child was not heralded by fanfare or announcement. Instead, it arrived quietly, carried in hushed tones across the fields, whispered from one quarter to the next, spreading like a slow, persistent wind that could not be ignored. Those who had witnessed the first child's existence found themselves caught between disbelief and dread, unable to reconcile what they knew with the world they had been taught to trust. The second infant emerged on a neighboring plantation, miles away, yet the similarities were so precise that denial became impossible. The child's skin was the same strange, pale tone, and the fine, straw-colored hair matched the first almost perfectly. Even in the dim light of early morning, it was clear, the anomaly was not a fluke. As the news traveled, the reactions among those who lived within the rigid structure of plantation society were varied but uniformly intense. Plantation owners were the first to sense threat. It was not simply the presence of the children that alarmed them, but what their existence implied. The social and racial hierarchies, so carefully maintained through law, custom, and fear, were suddenly in jeopardy. If a child could exist who did not fit the prescribed mold, what other rules might fail? What other assumptions could be challenged? The very foundations of control, the certainty of who belonged where, who could claim what, who could be punished for what, were now questioned, and even the slightest uncertainty was intolerable in a world that thrived on order. The enslaved women, who bore the brunt of labor, punishment, and the intimate violence of the system, experienced a different kind of alarm. For them, the children represented danger, yes, but also a profound moral and emotional complexity. They understood more than anyone the consequences of such anomalies being observed. A child born under circumstances that violated the perceived order could provoke suspicion, lead to retribution, or become a bargaining chip in an already oppressive hierarchy. Yet there was also a quiet sense of shared understanding, a recognition that the children's existence spoke to truths long denied. Among themselves, they whispered theories, half-formed and careful, about what could have caused such impossibilities. Some spoke of divine punishment or celestial testing, others, more pragmatic, suspected deliberate acts concealed by those in power. The overseers and middle-ranking staff, men who carried out the physical and logistical enforcement of the plantation system, found themselves caught between their authority and their fear. They had learned to trust the world according to its apparent rules, skin tone determined loyalty, labor was to be managed, and deviation was punishable. But these children defied comprehension. The second discovery created cognitive dissonance, a mental strain that made simple tasks seem overwhelming. Some attempted to rationalize, the light-skinned infants were perhaps products of hidden unions between enslaved women and white men, or perhaps they were rare genetic anomalies. Others responded with suppression, threatening silence and punishing speculation as dangerous or sinful. Yet the facts themselves remained undeniable, insistent, and impossible to erase. The plantation families reacted with a combination of denial and defensive explanation. Letters were written, though carefully censored, conversations were held behind closed doors with whispered reassurances that the incidents were isolated and would not affect the broader social order. Some family members insisted that the children must have been the product of secretive arrangements, mistakes made by women who had been led astray. Others feared scandal, imagining that rumors could escape their plantations and tarnish reputations, weaken alliances, or invite legal scrutiny. In every case, the emphasis was on containment, keep the anomaly invisible, and the illusion of order could remain intact. Fear of the unknown intensified as the news circulated beyond individual plantations. Townspeople, merchants, and clergy began to hear rumors that could not easily be dismissed. While the first child might have been attributed to coincidence or imagination, the second made pattern recognition unavoidable. People began to notice repetition where before there was only anomaly. The human mind is quick to seek patterns, and once seen, patterns demand answers. Yet no satisfactory answers existed within the existing framework of law, theology, or science as understood by the people of the time. The resulting tension permeated daily life, creating an undercurrent of suspicion and vigilance. Among the enslaved, the pattern of anomalies introduced both hope and terror. Some interpreted the children as symbols, spiritual signifiers that spoke to resilience and hidden truths about the world's injustices. Others feared them as omens of deeper wrath, manifestations of divine punishment for the violence inflicted upon them. The elders, keepers of oral histories and traditions, encouraged careful observation, teaching younger members to recognize subtle cues in speech, movement, and behavior. These practices were survival mechanisms, ways to navigate a reality in which deviation from the expected could be lethal. The children, in this sense, became both mirrors and messengers, reflections of unspoken truths, warnings of potential consequences. The local clergy, who had long maintained influence over both enslaved and free populations, attempted to intervene by framing the anomalies within familiar religious constructs. Sermons were delivered that spoke of God's inscrutable will, divine punishment, or moral failings. Religious explanations served a dual purpose. They reassured the white congregations that order remained intact and simultaneously warned the enslaved to remain silent and obedient. Yet even the clergy could not fully reconcile the repeated anomalies with their teachings. Private conversations between ministers reveal unease, a subtle acknowledgement that not all phenomena could be neatly explained by Scripture, and that faith alone might not account for the tension spreading through the community. Scientific and medical perspectives, limited and constrained by the knowledge of the time, also failed to provide clarity. Local doctors were called upon to assess the infants, to examine, measure, and attempt to classify them according to prevailing understandings of heredity and biology. They proposed theories, maternal impressions, rare genetic conditions, or even divine interventions, but none were satisfying. Each explanation strained credulity, bending scientific reasoning to accommodate social and racial assumptions rather than confronting reality. The results were inconclusive, leaving the anomaly unresolved and the tension among the community to fester. The repeated occurrences began to influence behavior subtly but profoundly. Plantation owners imposed more stringent controls, requiring increased supervision of enslaved women and families. Sleep patterns were disrupted as overseers patrolled the quarters at night, anxious to detect signs of unusual pregnancies or unauthorized movement. Community interactions shifted as people exchanged guarded glances, whispers, and coded signals to convey suspicion or reassurance. Even seemingly mundane tasks, cooking, cleaning, tending fields, were undertaken under heightened awareness, with the knowledge that any misstep could lead to further inquiry, punishment, or accusation. The social fabric became taut, stretched by fear, uncertainty, and the growing awareness that the natural order, long presumed absolute, was not infallible. Rumors and partial sightings compounded the psychological strain. Some claimed to have seen children with unusual features, light skin appearing briefly as infants were moved from one quarters to another. Others told of pregnant women whose conditions were monitored obsessively, or of infants hidden away immediately after birth. Stories blurred between fact and speculation, yet each retelling reinforced the perception that something larger, systematic, and impossible was occurring. The repeated pattern of pale infants transformed from mere coincidence into a mystery that could not be contained by silence or suppression. The second child's discovery also illuminated the moral contradictions inherent in the plantation system. For enslaved women, the infants symbolized the hidden violations of bodily autonomy, the unspoken coercions and abuses committed by men in power. For white families, the children became inconvenient evidence, proof that the carefully maintained veneer of control could not entirely suppress the truths embedded in human behavior. These contradictions eroded confidence subtly at first, then more overtly, fostering a climate of unease, suspicion, and emotional tension that touched every level of the community. By the time the third or fourth anecdotal report emerged, the idea that a pattern existed had taken hold. People began to chart the events mentally, mapping occurrences across plantations and neighboring towns, noting dates, family connections, and similarities in appearance. The growing sense of inevitability, combined with the absence of satisfactory explanations, created a pervasive anxiety that extended beyond individual plantations. The community, once confident in its hierarchies and definitions, now faced an unsettling reality: nature, or human action, could not be fully constrained by law, custom, or belief. The psychological impact extended beyond fear and curiosity. It penetrated the very fabric of social interactions, altering relationships between enslaved people, overseers, and owners. Trust eroded as the anomaly remained unresolved. Suspicion crept into daily routines, conversations, and decisions. Children were scrutinized, women were watched, and even casual glances carried meaning. The repeated discovery of white infants destabilized the expected order of life, transforming ordinary days into exercises in vigilance, calculation, and anxiety. Every smile, every gesture, every piece of gossip became freighted with implication. The normal rhythms of human life slowed and strained by an invisible tension. The second infant was more than an isolated event, it was the hinge upon which the perception of the entire region began to shift. Where one anomaly might have been dismissed, two demanded acknowledgement. Patterns, once recognized, cannot be unseen, and with recognition comes the psychological weight of implication, suspicion, and fear. People adjusted their behaviors, altered routines, and adopted new rituals, some practical, some superstitious, in attempts to contain the uncontainable. The social fabric, already tightly wound, began to stretch in ways that would have lasting consequences. By the time the day ended and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields and quarters, it was clear that life would never return to its previous state of unquestioned certainty. The pale infants had forced a confrontation with realities that had been carefully concealed, realities that demanded attention despite the social structures built to deny them. The second discovery had confirmed a pattern, destabilizing assumptions, challenging authority, and sowing the seeds of psychological unrest that would ripple across generations. People went to sleep that night with new awareness and new dread, carrying the knowledge that the world they had known, so meticulously ordered, so strictly defined, was far more fragile than they had ever imagined. The quarters were alive with whispers, voices that moved like smoke through narrow passageways and over the rough-hewn floors of shared cabins. Every sound seemed heavier now, each creak of wood or rustle of straw amplified by the tension that had taken root with the first pale child and deepened with the second. The women who had cared for infants for years suddenly approached each birth with caution, scanning the newborns with a mixture of fear and hope, aware that one might defy the boundaries imposed by law, custom, and the unspoken rules of the plantation. Children, who had once been ordinary extensions of life and labor, now carried the weight of possibility, their appearances scrutinized for anomalies that no one dared fully name. The enslaved quarters were not merely physical spaces, they were living archives of memory, knowledge, and observation. Elders recounted past events, connecting subtle details across years and plantations, building mental maps of patterns in human behavior, births, and disappearances. These narratives, often carried in song, in hushed speech, or in gestures and coded signals, allowed knowledge to move rapidly despite the oppressive constraints imposed by overseers. Now, with the recurring emergence of pale infants, these archives of observation were activated in ways both urgent and cautious. Women remembered previous births, compared features, whispered warnings, and prepared for contingencies they had never formally considered. Stories traveled differently within the quarters than they did outside. Among enslaved people, the presence of these children was a topic of concern, speculation, and spiritual interpretation. Some believed the infants were omens, signs of divine intervention or warning. Others saw them as embodiments of injustice, evidence of concealed abuses that had long been ignored. These interpretations, while grounded in lived experience and cultural knowledge, were dangerous to voice aloud in the presence of overseers or plantation families. To speak of the children as anything more than coincidence could invite scrutiny, punishment, or worse. And yet, the very act of sharing these stories quietly was a way to maintain agency, to acknowledge truth where silence otherwise prevailed. Outside the quarters, in the big houses, a different kind of silence reigned. Plantation owners, accustomed to absolute control, were suddenly confronted with evidence that resisted containment. They spoke in measured tones, delivered instructions to overseers with a veneer of calm that barely masked anxiety. Conversations were conducted behind closed doors, letters were carefully written and censored, and events were described in ways that minimized alarm while maintaining a semblance of rationality. The anomaly of the children disrupted the routine of authority, forcing the powerful to confront the possibility that their perception of control was incomplete. Even as they sought to suppress discussion, the mere act of hiding the truth amplified its psychological impact, creating tension that extended through the entire household and beyond. Religious belief became another layer in this complex web of understanding and suppression. Clergy, who had long acted as arbiters of morality and social order, attempted to contextualize the phenomenon within familiar spiritual frameworks. Sermons emphasized obedience, submission, and the unknowable wisdom of divine providence. White congregations were reassured that God's plan was immutable and that apparent anomalies were tests or moral lessons. For the enslaved, religious interpretation carried a dual burden. It provided an explanatory lens but also reinforced a hierarchy that demanded silence and compliance. Even as some sought solace in prayer, the tension between spiritual interpretation and lived reality grew increasingly pronounced. Despite these layers of interpretation and suppression, the physical presence of the children could not be ignored. Their appearances, movements, and very existence forced confrontation with questions that had been long avoided. Who were their parents? How had they come to be? What did their existence reveal about power, violence, and secrecy on the plantations? These questions circulated quietly but insistently, infiltrating thought patterns, daily routines, and interpersonal dynamics. The children became more than anomalies. They were mirrors reflecting truths that the social, economic, and moral structures were designed to suppress. The pattern recognition intensified fear. While one child could be explained away as a fluke, 2, or 3, implied a systemic issue. People began watching more closely, adjusting behavior in ways subtle and overt. Enslaved women, aware that pregnancy could be scrutinized and punished, modified movements, interactions, and communications. Overseers increased vigilance, patrolling quarters at night, questioning births, and monitoring even minor deviations from routine. Plantation owners, anxious to maintain reputation and control, implemented stricter rules, demanded reports, and ensured that anomalies were addressed swiftly and discreetly. Every individual, regardless of status, was caught in the tension between fear and obligation, observation and suppression. As whispers spread, imagination filled the spaces left by absence of clear explanation. Elders told stories of children who were different in other ways, tracing possible precedents in distant plantations or earlier generations. Superstition mingled with observation. Some believed the children represented spiritual retribution, others that they were signs of hidden sins revealed by divine justice. These stories carried a dual function. They provided a sense of understanding and context while also serving as warnings, subtly guiding behavior to avoid detection, punishment, or moral censure. In this way, folklore and superstition became instruments of both psychological management and cultural preservation. At the same time, the repetitive nature of these anomalies introduced a psychological strain that affected all levels of the plantation hierarchy. Enslaved people experienced heightened anxiety, constantly scanning their environment and anticipating the possibility of new anomalies. Overseers and middle-ranking staff wrestled with cognitive dissonance. They had learned to trust predictable social and racial patterns, yet those patterns were being challenged repeatedly. Plantation owners confronted moral and social contradictions, aware that their authority relied on the illusion of control even as reality proved less pliable. Across the community, sleep became lighter, work more tense, and human interactions more tentative. The presence of the children created a state of suspended vigilance, an awareness that nothing could be taken for granted. Attempts at rational explanation often failed, further fueling the tension. Local doctors were consulted to assess the infant's health, appearance, and possible causes of their unusual features. They suggested rare genetic conditions, maternal impressions, or other biological anomalies, yet their conclusions were tentative, qualified, and ultimately unsatisfying. Science, as understood at the time, could not account for the repeated pattern, and its failure only intensified anxiety and speculation. Religious, social, and medical interpretations collided, leaving the community without a coherent framework to integrate the phenomenon. The inability to categorize or resolve the mystery created a persistent sense of unease, one that permeated daily life, work, and conversation. As weeks and months passed, the children's existence continued to ripple through the plantations. Enslaved women became more cautious during pregnancies, covering births with secrecy, adjusting behaviors to avoid scrutiny, and teaching younger generations the strategies necessary to navigate an increasingly fraught environment. Overseers tightened monitoring protocols, reinforcing rules and increasing surveillance. Plantation owners, conscious of reputation and authority, issued instructions to minimize exposure and preserve appearances. The tension between observation and suppression, knowledge and secrecy, created an atmosphere thick with suspicion, fear, and quiet calculation. The repetition of anomalous births also fostered an emergent sense of pattern and inevitability. Observers, both enslaved and free, began to anticipate further occurrences, to chart potential timelines, and to prepare responses in advance. In this way, the mystery transformed from a series of isolated events into a systemic challenge, one that demanded attention, adaptation, and constant vigilance. The children's existence became a lens through which the entire social, economic, and moral structure could be examined, revealing fragilities, inconsistencies, and hidden abuses that had previously been concealed. Even as explanations were sought and surveillance intensified, the human consequences became undeniable. The infants themselves, the mothers, and the community were all touched by the anomaly's presence. Relationships shifted subtly as fear infiltrated intimacy, trust became conditional, and behavior was mediated by anticipation of scrutiny. The social equilibrium, once maintained through rigid hierarchies and predictable patterns, began to wobble under the weight of these repeated contradictions. The children were no longer simply anomalies, they had become catalysts, their very presence demanding confrontation with realities long suppressed. By the end of this period, the social and psychological fabric of the region had been irrevocably altered. The whispered conversations in the quarters, the careful observations of overseers, the private discussions among plantation owners, and the tentative interpretations of clergy and doctors had all contributed to a growing awareness. The existing order, so carefully constructed and meticulously enforced, was under strain. Every day carried the possibility of another anomaly, another challenge, another moment when reality would not conform to expectation. In this way, the children, their appearances, and the whispers surrounding them became inseparable from the lived experience of the plantations, a persistent, quiet force reshaping perception, behavior, and belief. The local churches became a central stage for the silent drama unfolding across the plantations, their spires casting long shadows over the fields as if presiding over a truth too dangerous to acknowledge openly. Within these walls, the faithful congregated, seeking comfort, guidance, and order in a world that had begun to feel unpredictable. Sermons took on a new intensity, framed in language designed to reassure some and to warn others. God's will was invoked to explain what could not be explained otherwise, morality was elevated to absolutes, and obedience was preached as the ultimate safeguard against chaos. In this context, the repeated appearance of pale infants could be addressed without being named directly, contained within the rhetoric of sin, divine testing, and moral responsibility. For the white congregations, these sermons served a dual purpose. On the one hand, they reinforced the comforting illusion that order remained intact. God's providence, the preacher insisted, was absolute, and any anomaly that appeared in the world was merely a test, a lesson, or a moral challenge. No social hierarchy could be threatened so long as faith and discipline prevailed. On the other hand, the repetition of these religious explanations subtly acknowledged that something was amiss, that the fabric of daily life was vulnerable to disruption. Parishioners left the pews reassured outwardly but unsettled inwardly, a cognitive dissonance that underscored the fragility of the world they had long believed immutable. For the enslaved, the church functioned in a far more complex and layered way. The sermons they attended were often the same as those delivered to white congregants, yet their interpretation was filtered through lived experience, cultural memory, and the quiet knowledge of abuses and injustices that were hidden in plain sight. Obedience was preached as a moral imperative, yet many understood that this obedience was enforced through violence, surveillance, and social coercion. Within this tension, the pale infants became symbols that carried multiple meanings. They were signs of divine intervention for some, evidence of the hidden sins and abuses for others, and a tangible reminder that the social order imposed upon them was fragile, incomplete, and morally compromised. The clergy, for their part, were acutely aware of the challenge the children represented. In private, some admitted unease, recognizing that repeated anomalies did not align neatly with scripture or moral teaching. They worried about maintaining credibility, authority, and social standing, and many sought to reconcile the existence of the children with theological frameworks that could absorb anomaly without threatening the hierarchy they were invested in preserving. Sermons thus became a balancing act, conveying reassurance to some, warning others, and shaping interpretation in a way that protected the status quo. Religious authority, in this sense, was not simply spiritual, it was also political, social, and deeply intertwined with the preservation of power. The sermons themselves were carefully structured. Sin was emphasized, often linked to obedience and moral purity, framing deviation from expectation as a spiritual failing rather than a social or biological anomaly. The congregation was instructed that transgression could manifest in unexpected ways, and that vigilance, confession, and moral discipline were necessary to maintain both personal and communal order. The repetition of this message, delivered week after week, reinforced a psychological structure that allowed people to contain fear without confronting the reality directly. For white parishioners, it reassured them that their authority remained legitimate. For the enslaved, it provided a framework within which they could interpret danger, oppression, and injustice without necessarily naming the full truth. Yet even within these religious structures, cracks appeared. Some members of the white congregations began to observe anomalies in behavior and circumstance that could not be fully explained by doctrine. Pregnant women were watched more closely, children were scrutinized, and the subtle changes in interaction patterns were impossible to ignore. Whispers of the pale infants occasionally penetrated the carefully maintained boundaries of propriety, forcing individuals to confront a reality that threatened to disrupt the social and moral hierarchies they depended upon. The sermons, while powerful, were not sufficient to fully contain anxiety, and private fear began to intersect with public ritual in ways that heightened tension rather than alleviating it. For the enslaved, the moral and theological frameworks imposed by the church intersected with lived knowledge in complex ways. They understood, often instinctively, that the children represented hidden truths about the abuses of power that had long been denied or suppressed. Yet outward acknowledgement carried risk, creating a tension between internal understanding and external behavior. Some developed coded methods of communication, allowing them to discuss the anomalies without attracting attention. Others relied on oral histories, spiritual practices, and traditional rituals to process what was happening, blending observation, experience, and belief into a framework that could accommodate the seemingly impossible while preserving survival. The repeated appearance of pale infants also influenced behavior in the larger community. Plantation owners, reassured by religious framing, continued to assert authority but did so with increased vigilance and subtle anxiety. Overseers enforced rules more strictly, monitored labor with greater scrutiny, and intervened in daily life in ways that reflected the underlying tension. Enslaved individuals adjusted their behavior accordingly, employing caution, subterfuge, and observation to navigate an environment in which deviations from expectation could have severe consequences. In this way, the moral authority of the church intersected with the social, economic, and physical realities of life on the plantations, shaping perception, action, and response across all levels of society. Rumors, gossip, and whispered observation circulated in parallel to formal religious instruction. Stories of unusual births, of children who did not conform to expected appearances, were passed from quarters to quarters, from field to field, carefully measured and coded to avoid detection. Elders used these narratives to educate younger generations, to warn of potential danger, and to provide a sense of continuity and understanding in a world where official acknowledgement was impossible. In this context, folklore, superstition, and religious instruction merged, creating a multi-layered interpretive system that allowed individuals to navigate fear, uncertainty, and anomaly without inviting reprisal. The psychological impact of this dual framework, religious reassurance and lived observation, was profound. Individuals were forced to maintain simultaneous understandings, outward compliance with doctrine, social hierarchy, and authority, and inward recognition of anomalies, contradictions, and moral violations. Sleep became fragmented, work became more deliberate and cautious, and human interactions were shaped by subtle signals of trust, observation, and suspicion. The tension became a pervasive, almost tangible presence, infiltrating every aspect of daily life and creating a persistent sense of vigilance that could not be relaxed. At the same time, the repeated religious framing served to contain what might otherwise have been existential panic. By casting the anomalies as moral tests, divine warnings, or lessons in obedience, the sermons provided a framework that allowed both enslaved and free individuals to interpret the world without collapsing entirely under the weight of uncertainty. The children were acknowledged indirectly, their presence filtered through language that maintained order and authority, even as it left questions unresolved and anxieties unspoken. This dynamic, religious containment intersecting with lived reality, shaped the community in subtle but pervasive ways. Social norms were reinforced, but always under the shadow of fear and anticipation. Authority was exercised, but tempered by uncertainty. Observation, surveillance, and rumor became integral to daily life, providing both protection and stress. The pale infants, while rarely discussed openly, became central figures in this complex system, their existence influencing behavior, perception, and belief in ways that extended far beyond individual households or plantations. By the end of this period, the interplay between religious authority and lived experience had created a society in which every individual carried a dual consciousness, one shaped by doctrine, propriety, and obedience, and another shaped by observation, fear, and suspicion. The pale infants had become symbols and catalysts, forces that exposed the fragility of social, moral, and psychological structures. Their repeated presence, interpreted through sermons, whispers, and coded observation, had begun to reshape the collective consciousness of the community, leaving all who lived within it acutely aware that the world they thought stable was far more vulnerable than they had ever imagined. The tension that had been simmering for months began to manifest in ways that were increasingly difficult to contain. On the plantations, fear became a pervasive presence, infiltrating both conscious thought and the unconscious movements of daily life. Morning routines were punctuated by cautious glances, work tasks were performed with heightened awareness, and even the smallest deviations in behavior were scrutinized. The enslaved women, already burdened with labor and surveillance, now carried the added weight of constant observation, aware that any perceived anomaly could provoke suspicion or punishment. The pale infants had become more than curiosities, they were catalysts for heightened vigilance, psychological strain, and social tension. Overseers, tasked with maintaining order, responded to this uncertainty with a mixture of aggression and anxiety. Patrols intensified, rules were enforced more strictly, and nightly inspections became commonplace. Their authority, previously uncontested, was now shadowed by doubt. They had been trained to recognize and control predictable patterns, yet the repeated appearance of anomalies challenged their capacity to govern effectively. This cognitive dissonance generated stress that often manifested as harsher punishments, erratic behavior, or obsessive scrutiny. Enslaved people, in turn, learned to navigate this heightened tension, adjusting movements, speech, and interactions to avoid triggering suspicion. The cycle of observation and response created a feedback loop in which fear itself became an instrument of control, shaping behavior without the need for overt confrontation. Among the plantation families, the psychological impact was equally profound. The pale infants forced a confrontation with truths that were deliberately obscured, realities that challenged the moral and social foundations upon which their authority rested. Owners who had long prided themselves on control and order now found themselves acting defensively, issuing instructions with subtle urgency, monitoring the movements of enslaved families more closely, and seeking to contain any spread of information that could undermine social stability. Reputation, social standing, and the illusion of control were all threatened by the possibility that the anomalies could be observed, discussed, or interpreted in ways that exposed hidden transgressions. The repeated discoveries intensified not only fear but also suspicion, turning neighbor against neighbor. In the enslaved quarters, women watched one another carefully, aware that the behavior of a single individual could draw the attention of overseers and plantation owners. Whispered conversations became cautious and coded, stories of unusual births were shared selectively, and communal decision-making became a delicate balancing act between safety and the need to acknowledge truth. Within this web of observation and discretion, trust became conditional and fragile, negotiated continuously in response to shifting circumstances. Children, too, were affected by this heightened awareness. Infants born under ordinary circumstances were scrutinized, measured against expectations, and compared with the pattern established by the pale children. Mothers worried not only about their own well-being but also about the implications of their children's appearances. The act of birth, once a private and intimate experience, became fraught with anxiety, as the possibility of anomaly carried social, economic, and psychological consequences. The labor process itself, already physically and emotionally taxing, was now layered with additional vigilance, observation, and preparation. Every cry, every movement, every mark on a child's skin was noted and interpreted, sometimes obsessively. The pattern of anomalies also affected relationships between overseers, plantation staff, and owners. Authority, which had previously operated on confidence and predictable behavior, now relied on constant observation, speculation, and preemptive action. Conversations were measured, decisions were made with a heightened sense of urgency, and minor deviations from routine were interpreted as potential threats. Social interactions became a form of surveillance, with each participant aware that their actions could have consequences far beyond immediate perception. Even routine tasks, such as distributing work assignments or monitoring crop production, were influenced by the need to anticipate and mitigate the perceived risks associated with repeated anomalies. The psychological strain was compounded by the persistence of uncertainty. Despite repeated observation, no clear explanation for the anomalies existed. Local physicians offered theories grounded in contemporary medical knowledge, proposing rare genetic conditions, maternal impressions, or other biological factors. Clergy framed the occurrences in religious terms, invoking divine will, moral tests, or spiritual punishment. Plantation families relied on social hierarchy and authority to assert control over perception and behavior. Yet none of these frameworks fully accounted for the repeated emergence of pale infants. The inability to categorize or resolve the phenomenon created ongoing anxiety, reinforcing vigilance and suspicion across every level of the plantation hierarchy. This sustained tension had cumulative effects on mental and emotional states. Enslaved women exhibited hypervigilance, adjusting movements and behaviors in anticipation of scrutiny. Overseers displayed signs of stress and irritability, their authority undermined by uncertainty and fear of the unknown. Plantation owners experienced moral and cognitive dissonance, confronted with evidence that contradicted their assumptions about social order, racial hierarchies, and human behavior. Sleep was disrupted, work was punctuated by apprehension, and communal rituals became imbued with underlying tension. In this environment, ordinary life was never ordinary, every interaction carried the weight of potential consequence. The fear also transformed social norms and daily routines. Community members adopted new strategies for concealment, observation, and communication. Among the enslaved, knowledge of anomalies was shared selectively, encoded in stories, songs, and gestures. Among overseers and owners, increased surveillance and stricter enforcement protocols became routine. These adaptations, while practical, also reinforced the psychological impact of the anomalies, embedding fear, suspicion, and vigilance into every aspect of daily life. The pale infants had become not only symbols of anomaly but also instruments through which social control and psychological pressure were perpetuated. Rumors amplified the emotional and psychological intensity. Stories circulated about hidden births, children whisked away under the cover of darkness, and secretive interventions by plantation owners. Some accounts were accurate, some embellished, and some entirely fabricated, yet the cumulative effect was to create a pervasive atmosphere of uncertainty and dread. People adjusted behavior based on the possibility of observation or intervention, anticipating consequences that were often indirect or unseen. The repeated anomalies had created a system in which perception, imagination, and reality were tightly interwoven, each influencing the other in complex and often unpredictable ways. Over time, the cumulative effect of fear, suspicion, and repeated observation led to broader social consequences. Relationships, both among the enslaved and between enslaved people and those in authority, were reshaped by anticipation of anomaly. Communication became cautious and coded, routines were altered to minimize exposure to scrutiny, trust became conditional and continuously negotiated. The pale infants, once merely anomalies in appearance, had become central to the social dynamics of the community, influencing behavior, thought, and interaction in ways that extended far beyond their immediate presence. The psychological weight of these anomalies extended beyond the plantations themselves. Towns, markets, and social gatherings were touched by the ripple effects of fear and suspicion. People began to recognize patterns not only in appearance but in timing, behavior, and rumor. Observers across different plantations compared notes, adjusted expectations, and developed informal networks of awareness and caution. The pale infants, while physically confined to specific households, had become a phenomenon that shaped regional consciousness, creating tension, vigilance, and uncertainty across multiple layers of social and geographic space. In this environment, life was measured not only by labor and obedience but by anticipation of anomaly. Every glance, every gesture, every decision was filtered through the possibility that the extraordinary could emerge at any moment. The repeated presence of pale infants had transformed the psychological landscape, embedding fear, suspicion, and anticipation into the daily experience of both enslaved people and those in positions of authority. By the end of this period, it was clear that the community had been fundamentally altered. The social order, though outwardly intact, was permeated by invisible tension, its stability contingent on constant vigilance and careful management of both perception and reality. Attempts to understand the anomalies of the pale infants soon moved beyond observation and speculation and into the realm of inquiry, explanation, and tentative science. The repeated appearance of these children had unsettled everyone, from enslaved families to plantation owners, and left no one satisfied with ignorance. Local physicians were consulted, their presence summoned to examine the children with both curiosity and apprehension. They measured, weighed, and recorded observations with meticulous attention, hoping that through empirical scrutiny they could identify a cause, categorize the phenomenon, or at least offer an explanation that would restore a semblance of order to the unsettled community. Yet each examination revealed new questions rather than answers. The physicians approached their task with the prevailing knowledge of mid-19th century medicine, a framework both limited and steeped in social assumptions. They examined the infant's skin, hair, and physical development, noting deviations from what was considered normal within the population. Some suggested rare genetic conditions, describing the children as living examples of infrequent hereditary traits. Others proposed maternal impressions, a widely believed notion that a mother's experiences, fears, or desires could imprint physical characteristics onto the unborn child. Still others whispered of environmental factors, nutritional differences, or even divine intervention disguised as natural phenomena. Each theory was framed carefully, often to avoid challenging deeply ingrained beliefs about race, hierarchy, and propriety. Despite their efforts, no theory could fully account for the pattern. While a single anomaly could be rationalized as coincidence or rare occurrence, the repeated emergence of pale infants across multiple plantations defied simple explanation. Physicians expressed private frustration, noting that the phenomenon did not align with known laws of heredity or biology. Their reports, when shared with plantation owners, were deliberately vague, emphasizing uncertainty while providing just enough explanation to temper alarm. In public, they framed their findings cautiously, avoiding any assertion that might provoke scandal, threaten authority, or challenge the social order. The children's existence was too complex to resolve neatly, and each failed explanation intensified both curiosity and anxiety. The scientific attempts were mirrored by theological and moral interpretations. Clergy continued to frame the anomalies in religious terms, preaching that God's will could manifest in mysterious ways and that the children might be signs, tests, or lessons for the community. Sermons emphasized obedience, moral vigilance, and the consequences of hidden sin, casting the pale infants as symbols of divine observation. These interpretations, though comforting to some, created tension for others. While clergy provided a framework to make sense of the impossible, they also implicitly reinforced the fear that deviation, secrecy, or misbehavior could provoke consequences beyond human control. For the enslaved, the children became embodiments of moral, spiritual, and social complexity, a phenomenon that could not be ignored without risking both practical and existential consequences. The repeated occurrences encouraged more systematic observation. Plantation owners and overseers began to record births, track family connections, and note physical traits, creating informal logs designed to detect patterns or predict future anomalies. These records were guarded closely, often hidden from public view, as acknowledgement could provoke scandal, challenge authority, or disrupt social equilibrium. Families monitored pregnancies with heightened attention, seeking signs that might indicate another anomaly. Rumors of previous anomalies influenced behavior, shaping decisions about care, movement, and concealment. Each household developed its own protocols, combining observation, superstition, and social strategy in an attempt to anticipate and manage what could not be fully understood. The intersection of observation and theory created a psychological landscape dominated by vigilance and anticipation. Enslaved women internalized the uncertainty, modifying behaviors to minimize risk and to navigate the watchful eyes of overseers and owners. They communicated in subtle, coded ways, passing knowledge without risking detection. Overseers, aware that anomalies might undermine authority or provoke unrest, became increasingly meticulous, reinforcing control through both observation and coercion. Plantation owners, anxious about reputation and social order, attempted to mediate these tensions through private counsel, strategic interventions, and careful management of information. The entire community operated under a heightened awareness that the unusual could appear at any moment, and that every action carried potential consequences. Scientific theories were limited not only by knowledge but by the social context in which they were applied. Discussions of heredity, race, and maternal influence were filtered through assumptions of hierarchy and propriety. Physicians carefully avoided attributing anomalies to factors that might implicate white families, even if circumstantial evidence suggested otherwise. Observations were recorded with discretion, explanations were framed to preserve social norms, and anomalies were treated as curiosities rather than as evidence of broader systemic truths. The children's existence became a problem not only of biology but of social perception, forcing observers to balance empirical inquiry with the imperatives of social control. As the inquiries continued, the psychological impact on families and workers intensified. Anticipation of anomaly created constant vigilance. Mothers monitored infants for subtle signs, elders tracked pregnancies with heightened attention, and community members became increasingly attuned to deviations from expected behavior. Overseers and owners developed protocols for rapid intervention, concealment, or redirection when anomalies were suspected. This pervasive vigilance altered daily routines, interpersonal dynamics, and social interactions, embedding tension into the rhythm of life. Fear of exposure, suspicion of conspiracy, and uncertainty about origin combined to create an environment where psychological strain became as real and pervasive as physical labor. Religious and moral interpretation continued to intersect with emerging scientific observation. Some clergy sought to reconcile the children's existence with Scripture, emphasizing divine providence and moral lessons. Physicians framed anomalies in hereditary or environmental terms. Plantation owners and overseers relied on social hierarchy and authority to assert control over perception and behavior. Each interpretive lens, while distinct, reinforced the need for caution, discretion, and vigilance. The community operated under multiple, overlapping frameworks that simultaneously explained, contained, and heightened the psychological significance of the phenomenon. Attempts to integrate these explanations often failed. Scientific, religious, and social frameworks offered partial understanding but could not fully account for repeated anomalies. Physicians' analyses were constrained by contemporary knowledge, religious explanations required belief and faith, social structures depended on suppression, surveillance, and concealment. Each framework, when applied, highlighted the limits of understanding, leaving a persistent gap between observation and explanation. This gap became a focal point for anxiety, speculation, and rumor, amplifying the sense of uncertainty that had permeated the community since the first pale infant was discovered. The repeated anomalies prompted broader reflection on morality, power, and authority. For the enslaved, the children symbolized both hidden violations and the fragility of imposed systems. For overseers, they represented challenges to control and competence. For plantation owners, they became evidence of human behaviors and consequences that could not be entirely contained. Across these perspectives, the pale infants functioned as both literal and symbolic disruptors, exposing tensions, contradictions, and vulnerabilities within a social system premised on rigid hierarchy, racial categorization, and unquestioned authority. By the end of this period, the interplay of observation, theory, and suppression had reached a critical point. Scientific inquiry, theological interpretation, and social management all sought to contain, explain, or reconcile the phenomenon, yet none could fully succeed. The pale infants had become central figures in a complex network of fear, curiosity, and control, their existence demanding constant attention and shaping the psychological, social, and moral landscape of the region. What had begun as a mysterious anomaly had evolved into a sustained challenge to knowledge, authority, and perception, leaving all who encountered the phenomenon to navigate a world that was at once orderly, morally prescribed, and deeply unsettled. The fragile equilibrium that had been maintained through observation, speculation, and cautious interpretation began to crumble as the pattern of anomalies persisted and intensified. Where once the appearance of a pale infant could be contained through private scrutiny and careful suppression, the repetition of events began to generate consequences that could no longer be fully managed. Social tension, anxiety, and suspicion intensified, permeating every level of plantation life. The community found itself caught between fear of exposure and the compulsion to act, a psychological strain that reshaped daily routines, interpersonal relationships, and the very perception of reality. Within the enslaved quarters, the cumulative weight of vigilance began to exact a profound emotional toll. Women who had previously borne the burden of labor and surveillance now faced the additional stress of anticipating anomalies, guarding pregnancies, and concealing knowledge. Every interaction was filtered through a heightened awareness that a minor misstep could provoke scrutiny, punishment, or moral censure. Elders took on the responsibility of teaching younger members how to navigate these conditions, blending practical strategies with coded storytelling, ritual, and observation. In these moments, knowledge became both a tool of survival and a psychological burden, transmitting the anxiety of possibility along with practical guidance. The psychological strain extended to the overseers and middle-ranking staff. Charged with maintaining order, they found themselves increasingly trapped by the contradictions inherent in their authority. Their training relied on predictable patterns and established hierarchies, yet the repeated anomalies defied these expectations. Daily patrols, inspections, and enforcement became exercises in anxiety management as much as labor oversight. Each observed detail, an infant's appearance, a pregnant woman's behavior, a subtle shift in conversation, was imbued with potential significance, requiring interpretation, judgment, and action under the weight of uncertainty. This constant mental labor produced irritability, hypervigilance, and sometimes misdirected aggression, which in turn heightened tension for all those living and working on the plantation. Plantation owners, whose social, economic, and moral authority rested upon appearances of absolute control, experienced a distinct kind of cognitive and emotional strain. The pale infants were not merely curiosities, they were challenges to the very assumptions that structured power, race, and family life. Owners who had long relied on hierarchy to govern perception now confronted evidence that human behavior, hidden interactions, and biological phenomena could undermine control despite careful planning. Private discussions became intense, strategic, and often fraught with anxiety. Letters were drafted cautiously, overseers were instructed to increase vigilance, and subtle interventions were deployed to contain visibility. Yet the more control was asserted, the more tension accumulated, revealing the limitations of authority in the face of persistent anomaly. Rumors began to take on a life of their own, circulating with increasing speed and distortion. Stories of infants born with unusual features, of pregnancies concealed or exaggerated, of families intervening in secret, spread beyond the quarters and into neighboring plantations and towns. Some accounts were accurate, others were embellished or fabricated. The cumulative effect, however, was the creation of a shared consciousness dominated by fear, suspicion, and anticipation. People began to observe patterns in timing, appearance, and circumstance, trying to predict what might occur next. This emergent awareness reshaped social behavior, producing subtle hierarchies of information, guarded interactions, and coded communication across the entire community. Within this climate, the pale infants became symbols, loaded with meaning that extended far beyond their immediate physical presence. For the enslaved, they embodied hidden truths about abuse, coercion, and systemic violation. They became moral and spiritual signifiers, interpreted through a lens of cultural memory, oral history, and belief. For overseers, the infants were evidence of unpredictability that threatened control and competence. For plantation owners, they were signs of the limits of authority and the fragility of social order. Across these interpretations, the children's existence created a psychological tension that permeated every interaction, shaping perception, behavior, and decision-making in ways that were both subtle and profound. The children's presence also began to influence the physical and social structures of the plantations. Births were monitored with unprecedented attention, quarters were inspected more frequently, travel between households and fields was restricted or observed. Every routine, from feeding to labor assignments, was filtered through the lens of vigilance. Mothers, aware that deviation could draw attention, adopted practices of concealment, secrecy, and coded communication. Elders instructed younger members in observation, interpretation, and cautious response. Overseers, in turn, adapted their patrols and inspections to anticipate anomalies, creating a cycle in which anticipation of the unexpected became an organizing principle for daily life. Attempts to explain or rationalize the phenomena continued to collide with the limits of knowledge and authority. Physicians offered tentative biological theories, constrained by contemporary understanding of heredity, maternal influence, and racial assumptions. Clergy framed the anomalies within divine providence, moral testing, and spiritual lessons, often emphasizing obedience and vigilance as necessary responses. Plantation owners relied on social hierarchy, surveillance, and discretion to maintain order, issuing instructions and implementing measures to manage visibility. Yet none of these strategies fully addressed the repeated occurrences, leaving gaps that were filled by rumor, suspicion, and psychological tension. The repeated anomalies became both a problem to be solved and a source of ongoing anxiety. The community's collective psyche began to reflect the accumulation of uncertainty, fear, and vigilance. Every glance, gesture, and conversation was weighed against the possibility of anomaly. Sleep was disrupted, work was performed under strain, and relationships were mediated by observation and caution. Psychological stress became a pervasive element of daily life, producing heightened sensitivity to detail, hyper-awareness of social cues, and a constant readiness to respond to perceived threats. The presence of the pale infants, initially an isolated anomaly, had transformed the emotional and cognitive landscape of the entire plantation environment. As weeks and months passed, the anomaly's persistence began to influence long-term behavior and social structure. Patterns of secrecy, observation, and coded communication were institutionalized within the quarters. Among the enslaved, knowledge of anomaly management was formalized through oral instruction, ritual, and careful modeling. Among overseers and owners, monitoring and intervention protocols became embedded into daily routines, creating a pervasive climate of anticipatory control. The pale infants had thus reshaped not only immediate behavior but also the structural organization of the community, embedding vigilance and psychological tension into its very fabric. The repeated anomalies also catalyzed a reconsideration of morality, power, and human relationships. For the enslaved, the children represented hidden violations of bodily autonomy and moral contradictions inherent in the social system. For overseers, they embodied the limits of authority, the unpredictability of human behavior, and the consequences of deviation from expected patterns. For plantation owners, they exposed the fragility of social hierarchies, the risk of scandal, and the limits of control over both perception and reality. Across these dimensions, the children acted as both literal and symbolic disruptors, forcing the community to confront realities that had been long denied or suppressed. By the end of this period, the cumulative effect of repeated anomaly, vigilance, and social tension had become undeniable. The social, psychological, and emotional fabric of the plantations was permeated by anticipation, fear, and observation. Daily life was no longer ordinary. Every interaction, task, and gesture carried layers of meaning and consequence. The pale infants, though small and few, had transformed the lived experience of the community, embedding a persistent awareness that the predictable world they had once relied upon was fragile, contingent, and constantly challenged.